My brother walked into my house and said, "Since you don't have kids, the lake house should stay with someone who does." Then started planning summer vacations there. I looked at him and replied, "That's interesting, because the deed seems to disagree with you completely. Since you don't have kids, the lake house should stay with someone who does." Darren said it the way people say things they've been rehearsing for weeks. Casual, confident, like he was commenting on the weather or suggesting a restaurant for dinner. He was standing in the middle of my living room, the lake house living room, holding a bottle of iced tea, looking out at the water through the large picture window I'd had installed 3 summers ago. For about 4 seconds, nobody said anything. I remember thinking, he's joking. This is a joke. Darren does this sometimes. He floats something outrageous just to watch the room react, then laughs it off and grabs another drink. I'd seen him do it at Thanksgiving. I'd seen him do it at birthday parties. He liked the energy of a shocked room. So I waited for the laugh. It didn't come. Instead, Melanie, his wife, set her glass down on the kitchen counter and said, "We were thinking the last 2 weeks of July. The kids are out of school by then, and it lines up perfectly with Darren's vacation schedule." I looked at her. She was scrolling through her phone like she was already checking availability on a calendar that wasn't hers. "The back bedroom would be perfect for the girls," Darren continued, gesturing toward the hallway. And I was thinking, once it's properly transitioned, we could knock out that wall between the storage room and the second bath. Open it up a little. Make it more family-friendly. He said, transition, the way a real estate developer talks about a property acquisition. Smooth. Professional. Completely detached from the reality that he was standing in someone else's house, discussing renovations he had no authority to make. My cousin Shane, who was sitting on the couch with a bag of chips, glanced at me with an expression that said, "Are you hearing this?" I was hearing it. I just couldn't quite believe it yet. Because what Darren was describing wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't a conversation opener. It wasn't even a question. He and Melanie had arrived at the lake house that weekend with what I can only describe as a plan, a fully formed, already in progress plan. And they were presenting it to me the way people present things when they've already decided the outcome. I didn't say anything right away. That's something people who know me understand. I don't react in the moment. I watch. I listen. I let people finish revealing themselves before I say a single word. So I let Darren talk about renovation timelines. I let Melanie discuss which months worked best for the kids' summer schedules. I let them speak about this house, my house, the way homeowners speak about home improvement projects. And the whole time, something very quiet and very cold was settling in my chest. That's when I realized Darren wasn't making a suggestion. He believed the lake house already belonged to him. To understand what happened at that lake house, you have to understand how Darren and I were raised. Not because our childhood was dramatic. It wasn't. We didn't grow up in poverty or chaos. We grew up in a perfectly ordinary house in a perfectly ordinary suburb, with 2 parents who loved us, a decent school district, and enough stability that neither of us had any real excuse for turning out badly. The difference between us wasn't circumstance. It was character. And character, I've come to believe, is built in the small moments that nobody photographs. Our father, Brett, was the kind of man who believed deeply in the relationship between effort and outcome. He wasn't harsh about it. He didn't lecture. He just lived by it, consistently, without exception, and expected his sons to absorb the lesson through observation. When I was 12 and wanted a new bicycle, he sat down with me, calculated how many weeks of lawn mowing jobs it would take, wrote the number on a piece of paper, and put it on my desk. When I hit the number, I bought the bike. I still remember how that bike felt. I still remember that it felt different from anything I'd ever been given. Darren wanted the same bike that summer. Our mother, Qley, bought it for him 3 weeks later because, she explained, it wasn't fair for one brother to have something the other didn't. That was the pattern. I'm not saying Qley was a bad mother. She wasn't. She was warm and present and genuinely loving. But she had a particular blind spot when it came to Darren, which was that she confused protecting him from discomfort with protecting him from consequences. And those two things are not the same. Darren was 2 years younger than me, and from the time he was old enough to work the angles, he understood that a certain kind of charm, a certain easy smile, a certain way of making people feel like they were doing him a favor rather than getting played, could get him most of what the effort route would have gotten him, but faster and with less friction. He wasn't malicious about it. That's important. Darren wasn't a schemer in the movie villain sense. He was just someone who had been taught, repeatedly and unintentionally, that the normal rules of earning things had a side door, and that he personally had a key. In high school, When I studied for exams, Darren charmed his way into study groups where he copied notes. When I worked part-time jobs to save money, Darren borrowed from our parents and paid back most of it. When I graduated and moved into a small apartment I could barely afford, determined to build something from the ground up, Darren moved back home for 3 years because, as he put it just made more financial sense. None of this made him evil. It made him someone who had never been asked to sit with discomfort long enough to understand its value. And for a long time, that was mostly his problem, not mine. Then I bought the lake house. I need to tell you about the lake house, because if you don't understand what it means to me, nothing else in this story will make sense. I bought it 11 years ago, when I was in my late 30s, after a decade of decisions that most people around me found baffling. I drove a used car while colleagues drove new ones. I ate lunch at my desk while they went out. I passed on vacations, skipped upgrades, declined the kind of lifestyle inflation that hits most people in their 30s like a slow flood. I wasn't miserable. I was building. I had a number in my head, a specific number, and when I hit it, I started looking at lake properties within 3 hours of home. The house I found wasn't impressive when I first saw it. It was a 1970s A-frame on a quiet lake in the northern part of the state, surrounded by pine trees, with a dock that needed replacing and a kitchen that hadn't been touched since approximately the Ford administration. The roof was solid. The foundation was good. The view was extraordinary. I bought it. I spent the next 4 years renovating it slowly, carefully, personally. I didn't hire a contractor for everything. I learned things I'd never known how to do because I wanted my hands in it. I built the new dock myself over the course of 2 summers with help from a neighbor named Tracy, who had lived on the lake for 30 years and knew which lumber lasted and which rotted. I refinished the floors. I put in the picture window. I rebuilt the kitchen. When people asked me why I was putting so much work into a house I'd only use on weekends and vacations, I didn't always have a clean answer. The honest answer was that I was building a place that was entirely mine. Not shared, not borrowed, not assisted. Mine. I didn't have children. I'd been close to marriage twice, and it hadn't worked out. No dramatic story there, just the ordinary quiet sadness of things that end before they become permanent. Some people filled that particular space with different things. I filled mine with this property. The lake house was where I went when I needed to think. It was where I went on long weekends in October when the leaves turned and the lake went flat and silent. It was where I sat on the dock in the early morning with coffee and watched the mist come off the water and felt, consistently and reliably, like myself. Nobody gave it to me. Nobody helped me buy it. Nobody co-signed anything. I built it with a decade of quiet discipline, and I owned it completely, and I loved it in the particular way you love something you earned. That context matters, because Darren was about to tell me it should belong to someone else. The first time Darren said something about the lake house that made me pause, it was easy to dismiss. We were at a family dinner. Nothing special, just the usual monthly gathering at our parents' house, and I'd mentioned that I was spending the upcoming long weekend up at the property. Darren's daughter Emma, who was about 7 at the time, overheard me and asked if she could come. "Not this time, Em," I said. "I'm doing some work on the property." And Darren, from across the table, without looking up from his plate, said, "One day my kids are going to love that place." It was just 6 words, delivered casually, not even really directed at me, more like a thought spoken aloud. Melanie smiled and nodded, and the conversation moved on. I filed it away and forgot about it. 2 months later, at a birthday party for one of Darren's daughters, a relative I don't see often asked me about the lake house. Apparently, I'd mentioned it at some point, and it had come up in conversation. Before I could answer, Darren jumped in. "It's a great property," he said. "Good thing it's staying in the family." The relative nodded like that made complete sense. I looked at Darren. He was already talking about something else. Staying in the family is an interesting phrase. It can mean a lot of things. It can mean simply that the owner isn't planning to sell to strangers, which was true. It can also mean something more specific, more inheritance flavored, more this will pass down to the next generation flavored. Darren said it in a way that let it be heard as the second thing while technically being the first. I noticed that. I noticed the precision of it. Over the following year, the comments came maybe once every few months. Always casual, always deniable, always delivered in the smooth, offhand tone that Darren had perfected over a lifetime. "My kids are going to have so many summers there. It's great that the family has a place like that." Emma was asking me the other day when she gets to go back to Uncle's lake house. Nobody ever challenged these statements. Why would they? They sounded harmless. They sounded like the kind of fond, forward-looking thing an uncle says about a property he enjoys visiting. Nobody except me was listening closely enough to hear the accumulation. But I was listening, and I was starting to hear a pattern. The 4th of July barbecue at my parents' house was, by family tradition, the biggest gathering of the year. Extended family, family friends, neighbors. Brett manned the grill, Colleen organized everything else, and the backyard filled up in a way that only happens in summer. That year, Mitchell was there, a family friend who'd known my parents for over 20 years, a successful businessman who'd built a logistics company from nothing and sold it in his mid-40s for enough to retire comfortably. He was the kind of man who had no interest in impressing anyone because he had nothing left to prove. He asked direct questions and said what he actually thought, which made him my favorite person at most gatherings. Shane was there too, my cousin, 2 years younger than Darren and constitutionally incapable of pretending things were fine when they weren't. Shane had the kind of radar for social dynamics that most people only get after years of therapy, except he came by it naturally and used it mostly for observation rather than intervention. I was standing near the grill with Mitchell when I heard Darren across the yard, holding court with a cluster of relatives I rarely saw. I wasn't close enough to hear everything, but I caught fragments. Once it passes on. And the kids deserve a place like that. And he'd wanted to stay in the family. Mitchell was watching the same thing I was watching. He talks about that lake house like it's already in the will, Mitchell said quietly. I looked at him. He does. Is it? No. Mitchell nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was calculating something. Has he asked you directly? Not yet. He will, Mitchell said. And then Brett called him over and the conversation ended. Later in the evening, I found myself standing near the food table when an aunt I hadn't spoken to in months came over and said, with complete sincerity, "It's so lovely that you're going to leave the lake house to Darren's children. They'll treasure it." I stared at her. "I haven't made any such plans," I said carefully. She blinked, looked confused. "Oh, I must have misunderstood. I thought Darren mentioned." "He was mistaken," I said. She nodded and moved away, but the discomfort stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Someone was telling people things, and those people were starting to believe them. After the barbecue, the pace changed. Before, Darren's comments had been occasional, spread out enough that you could almost convince yourself they were coincidental. After that summer, Melanie joined in. And there's a particular energy shift that happens when two people start working a narrative together versus when one person is floating ideas alone. Melanie was social in the way that some people are social as a full-time occupation. She knew everyone, called everyone, kept the extended family web alive with phone calls and group messages and updates on the kids. She was the kind of person who kept a mental file on everyone she knew, cataloged by usefulness, organized by access. She started talking about the lake house the way people talk about a vacation home they own. "We're thinking about redoing the dock area eventually, make it safer for the girls. I found the most gorgeous bedroom furniture that would be perfect for the back rooms. We'd love to do a big family Christmas up there one year. Could sleep maybe 12 if we set it up right." She said these things to relatives, to family friends, to people at church, not in a confrontational way, in the warm, excited way of someone planning for the future, sharing good news, including people in something lovely. What she was doing, functionally, was building a constituency. By the time I fully registered what was happening, there was already a version of reality floating through my extended family in which the lake house's future was a settled matter. Not certain, perhaps, but assumed. The way you assume certain things about family property when enough people around you have treated the assumption as fact. I stayed quiet. I watched. Shane noticed before I addressed it directly with anyone. "You're very calm about this," he told me one afternoon when we were having lunch. "I'm watching," I said. "There's a difference between watching and waiting too long," Shane said. "Some things move faster than you think." He was right about that. It was a Tuesday evening in early September when Shane called me. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to not do anything rash with it." When have I ever done anything rash? Fair point. Okay, so I was at Kevin's last weekend, the birthday thing. Darren was there, and he was talking about the lake house. I mean, really talking about it. To people who barely know you. I was quiet. He told Marcus, "You know Marcus, married to your cousin Angela." He told him that you'd basically agreed, informally, that the property would go to him when you were done with it. He used those words. When he's done with it. Like you're borrowing it for a while. He said I agreed. I said, informally agreed. He was very careful about that. No paperwork, obviously, just a family understanding. I pressed 2 fingers to my forehead. There was no conversation. There was no agreement. There was nothing. I know that now. I didn't know that at the time, so I didn't say anything. I thought you should know what's circulating. How many people heard it? At that party? Maybe 6 or 8. Who knows where it went from there? I thanked Shane and sat with it for a while. A fabricated agreement. Not a vague implication, not a generous interpretation of something ambiguous I'd said. A fabricated agreement. Darren had told people that I had, at some point in some conversation, indicated that the lake house would eventually be his. That conversation had never happened, but now 6 to 8 people believed it had. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. 2 weekends later, I went up to the lake house alone, which I needed. The property does something for my nervous system that nothing else quite replicates. The moment I turn onto the gravel road leading to it, something in my chest loosens. That Saturday morning I was on the dock with coffee when Tracy appeared on her own dock next door, which was typical of our relationship. Neither of us needed to announce ourselves. We just appeared and talked when the timing worked. Tracy had been on this lake for 30 years. She knew every property, every owner, every story. She was observant in the way that comes from decades of paying attention to your immediate world rather than your phone. Your brother was up here about 3 weeks ago, she said, by way of greeting. I turned to look at her. He came with another couple, she continued. Spent most of Saturday walking the property. Went down to the water. Looked at the dock. Went inside. I didn't give him a key, I said. I figured as much from your face. She paused. He had one, though. He let himself in. I was quiet for a moment. Did he say anything? He showed the other couple around like. She paused, choosing her words carefully, like someone giving a tour of their own home. Talked about what he might change. Pointed out where the kids could fish. Talked about putting up a fire pit in the side yard. She looked at me evenly. I didn't know what the situation was between you two. I almost said something to him, but it wasn't my place. I wanted to mention it to you, though. I appreciate it, Tracy. You okay? I'm figuring it out, I said. I sat on that dock for another hour after she went inside, watching the water and thinking about the fact that my brother had a key to my house that I'd never given him, which meant he'd either made a copy at some point during a visit or found one I'd kept somewhere on the property. Either way, he had been inside my house without my knowledge or permission. Either way, the situation was no longer theoretical. I spent the next week quietly gathering information the way a person does when they want to understand the scope of something before they decide what to do about it. I called a few relatives I trusted. I asked careful questions. I listened more than I talked. What emerged was a picture I hadn't fully seen until I stepped back far enough. Darren had been telling people, not everyone, but selectively, strategically, that the lake house would eventually be his. The framing varied slightly depending on the audience. To some, it was that I'd informally agreed. To others, it was that the family had an understanding. To a few, it was simply framed as inevitable. The logic being that since I had no children and he had 3, the property would naturally end up with him. Melanie had reinforced this narrative in her own way, through her social network, talking about future plans for the house, discussing it as a family property, creating the impression of ownership through the accumulation of detail. Some family members had accepted this as fact, not because they'd interrogated it, but because nobody had contradicted it, and repeated information tends to calcify into belief in the absence of challenge. What was particularly interesting, and I say interesting because anger is less useful than clarity, was the internal logic of Darren's position. He seemed to genuinely believe that having children entitled him to a property he hadn't purchased, hadn't contributed to, hadn't maintained, and had no legal claim to. The children were, in his framework, a kind of trump card. A moral argument. My kids need this more than you do. The problem with that logic, of course, is that it only works if the person on the other end accepts the premise. I didn't accept the premise. I called Krista. The gathering that October was at my parents' house. One of those casual fall weekends that Qley organized every year, ostensibly just to get everyone together before the holiday season, made scheduling impossible. Dinner, some wine, the usual mix of family and family-adjacent people. Darren and Melanie arrived before I did. By the time I got there, they were already settled into the living room, kids running around the yard, drinks in hand, fully at ease. The evening was pleasant for about the first hour. I was in the kitchen with Brett and Mitchell when Darren appeared in the doorway, and something in his posture told me he'd decided tonight was the night. Hey, he said, in the tone of someone beginning a prepared statement. Can we talk for a minute? All of us. We moved to the living room. Colleen came in. Shane drifted in from the hallway. Melanie was already on the couch. Darren stood in the middle of the room with the comfortable authority of someone who believed the audience was on his side. I've been thinking about the lake house, he began. And I think it's time we talked honestly about its future. Nobody spoke. The reality is, he continued, that I have 3 kids. They're growing up. They need space, experiences, memories. The lake house is perfect for that. He paused. And I think we can all acknowledge that since you don't have kids, the lake house should stay with someone who does. Melanie nodded. Colleen looked at the floor. Mitchell studied his glass. Shane looked at me. Brett said nothing. The room was very quiet. I looked at Darren for a moment. I let the silence stretch. Not out of drama, just because I genuinely needed a second to make sure I said what I actually meant rather than what I felt. Then I said, "That's interesting." Darren waited. "Because the deed seems to disagree with you completely." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. Denser. More complicated. Darren's expression shifted. Not dramatically, just a slight rearrangement around the eyes, the jaw, the set of his mouth. The expression of a man recalculating. "I'm not talking about right now," he said. "I'm talking about the future. About what makes sense for the family." "The deed is current," I said. "It doesn't have a future tense. My name is on it. Your name is not." Melanie leaned forward. "No one is questioning your ownership. You've been planning vacations there," I said. "Discussing renovations. Telling relatives there's a family agreement. Bringing people to the property when I'm not there." I let that last part land. Silence. "The deed," I said, "disagrees with all of it." Darren didn't fold. I don't think I expected him to. People who have spent 42 years successfully navigating around difficulty don't collapse the first time someone pushes back. They reframe. They escalate. They find another angle. "This is unbelievable," he said. "You're going to sit here and act like family doesn't matter? Like this is just some transaction?" "I'm sitting here stating a fact," I said. "That's not the same thing. You don't have kids. You're barely up there half the time. Meanwhile, my daughters are growing up without the kind of experiences that property could give them. And you want to talk about deeds? I want to talk about reality," I said, "which is that I own that property. I paid for it, and no conversation we've ever had included anything about you receiving it." "You said." "I never said anything of the kind," I said, and I'd be careful about finishing that sentence. The room was extremely still. Darren looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from him before, something between frustration and the early stages of genuine anger. The charm was still there at the surface, but underneath it, something was shifting. "You're being selfish," he said. "This is what you always do. You calculate everything. You make everything about ownership and money and what's yours, and you don't think for 1 second about your own family." "I think constantly about my family," I said. "That's actually why I'm being very precise right now." Melanie said, "We've already talked to people about this. There's an expectation. Then those conversations need to be corrected," I said. Colleen looked like she wanted to dissolve into the furniture. Brett, who had not said a word, picked up his glass and drank from it slowly. Shane, in the corner, was watching with the careful neutrality of a person committed to not getting in the way of something necessary. "I'm not doing this here," Darren said finally. "This isn't over." "I know," I said. I had actually called Krista before that gathering, a fact I deliberately hadn't mentioned because I'd wanted to understand my own position clearly before I was in any room with Darren. Krista was a real estate attorney who'd handled the original purchase of the lake house and whose professional relationship with me had, over the years, extended into something approaching genuine respect. She was precise, organized, and allergic to ambiguity in a way I found deeply reassuring. We sat in her office on a Wednesday afternoon, and I walked her through everything. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I valued about her. When I finished, she opened a folder she'd pulled from my file. "Let me be very direct with you," she said. "The property is yours. Solely, completely, and without encumbrance. Your name is on the deed. There is no co-ownership, no joint tenancy, no life estate, no trust instrument that would give anyone else a claim." "He's suggesting there's an informal family agreement," I said. "An informal agreement about real property is not legally binding," she said. "Real property transfers require written instruments. Even if you had told him, verbally, that you intended to leave it to him, that verbal statement would not create a legal obligation. He doesn't know that," I said. Many people don't, she said, which is often how these situations develop. Someone hears what they want to hear or constructs what they wish had been said, and over time the constructed version becomes, in their mind, real. What about a key? He had access to the property. She made a note. Do you want to address that? I already changed the locks, I said. I did it the weekend after I found out. She nodded. Good. Beyond that, you should know that even if he's been entering the property, unless he's damaged it or claimed adverse possession, which requires years of open, hostile, continuous use that would be very difficult to establish given the circumstances, there's no claim there either. I left her office with what I'd expected to find: complete clarity. The lake house was mine. Every document confirmed it. There were no loopholes, no ambiguities, no technicalities that could be worked. Nothing. After the gathering, things moved faster. I didn't launch a campaign. I didn't call relatives and make speeches. I simply stopped being quiet about the facts when they came up, and I told the people closest to me what was actually true. I told Mitchell first, because Mitchell had been at the gathering and had witnessed enough to deserve a complete picture. He listened to everything. When I finished, he said, I want to be honest with you. I'd heard the version Darren was putting out. Not because I believed it. I didn't, fully, but because nobody was contradicting it. I know, I said. The version he was telling was specific enough to sound credible. He wasn't saying, I hope he leaves it to me. He was saying there was an understanding. Those are different things. He built it on nothing, I said. He built it on the assumption that you'd either go along or stay quiet, Mitchell said. And for a while, the quiet looked like confirmation. Shane required even less explanation because Shane had been watching from the beginning. When I told him about Tracy, about the key, about the specificity of what Darren had been saying to people, his expression went through 3 distinct phases in about 30 seconds. He made a copy of your key, Shane said. That's my conclusion. That's not a misunderstanding. That's not a guy who got confused about a family conversation. That's a plan. I didn't disagree. The information spread in the way information always spreads through a family network, imperfectly, in pieces, reaching different people at different times and in different forms. But the essential fact was simple enough that it survived transmission. The lake house belonged to me. There was no agreement, and Darren had been representing otherwise. Some relatives were surprised. Some were embarrassed that they'd accepted what he'd told them without question. A few called me directly to ask, and I gave them the same calm and complete answer each time. The constituency Melanie had built, brick by brick, was quieter now. Qley hosted Thanksgiving that year, as she always did, and it was the first major gathering after everything had come into the open. The atmosphere was different. Darren made a comment. I think it was about a property value thing, some news story about lake houses in the region, and the comment circled back, as these things had a habit of doing now, to the subject of the lake house. He said something about what he'd always envisioned for the property, and Brett, who had been quiet at gatherings like this for as long as I could remember, set down his fork and said, Darren, the house belongs to your brother. It has always belonged to your brother. Whatever you envisioned is just a vision. The table went silent. Brett picked his fork back up and continued eating. Qley looked at Darren, then looked at me, then looked at her plate. Melanie said nothing. Darren nodded, once, slowly, in the way of a man who has just run out of room. Here's the thing about consequences. The real ones are rarely dramatic. In the stories people tell about justice, there's usually a scene, a confrontation, a moment of visible reckoning where the person who did wrong has to stand up and account for themselves in front of everyone who matters. That's not what happened here. What happened was quieter and, I think, more lasting. People simply stopped taking Darren's word for things. Not about everything. Not about his job, or his opinions on football, or what restaurant to try, but about anything that involved ownership, family arrangements, shared expectations, anything where the details mattered. People started asking questions they hadn't asked before. Or they asked me separately. Or they said, interesting, in a tone that meant they'd circle back. That shift, that particular loss of automatic credibility, is something that doesn't announce itself and doesn't repair easily. Darren had spent years operating on the assumption that his charm and his confidence were sufficient. That if he said something with enough certainty and enough warmth, it would be received as true. That mechanism no longer worked the way it used to. Melanie pulled back too, though differently. She stopped talking about the lake house entirely, not because she'd been asked to, but because the subject had become, for the first time, a liability rather than an asset. The constituency she'd built had dissolved. The narrative she'd maintained had been publicly replaced. There was nothing left to manage. Colleen took the longest to fully absorb what had happened. For months after Thanksgiving, she was in a kind of quiet processing mode, not quite ready to fully acknowledge what she'd watched unfold, but no longer capable of pretending it hadn't. I knew her well enough to recognize that the hardest part for her wasn't that Darren had been wrong. It was that she'd enabled it, slowly and unintentionally, across decades of small protections that she'd never added up. I didn't press her on it. It wasn't mine to press. Darren called me on a Sunday afternoon in January. He asked if I had a few minutes. I said yes. He drove to my house, the city house, and we sat in my kitchen and he had coffee and we talked. He didn't come in with his usual energy. He came in like someone who'd practiced what they were going to say several times and still wasn't sure they'd gotten it right. I want to explain something, he started. Okay, I said. I convinced myself, he said. I know how that sounds. But I did. I took things you'd said, small things, offhand things, and I built something out of them that wasn't what you meant. He paused. Melanie and I talked about it like it was real enough that it started to feel real. And then I told people, and it felt even more real because they believed it. The key, I said. He looked down at his coffee. I had it from that summer 3 years ago when you asked me to check on the property during the week you were traveling. I should have returned it. You should have, I said. I know. We were quiet for a moment. I want to ask you something, he said. And I want you to be honest with me. I'm always honest with you. Do you hate me? I looked at him. No, I said. I'm not interested in hating you. That's not what this is about. Then what is it about? I thought about that for a moment. It's about the difference between what you want and what you've actually built, I said. You wanted that house. I understand that. It's a beautiful property. But wanting something isn't the same as deserving it. And telling people you're going to receive something you haven't earned doesn't make it yours. It just means that when reality arrives, it's going to be in front of an audience. Darren nodded slowly. I'm not your enemy, I said. You're my brother. But the lake house is mine. It will remain mine. And no version of this conversation is going to change that. I know, he said. He finished his coffee. He put the mug in the sink. He stood at the door for a moment before he left. I'm sorry, he said. I believe you, I said. Whether that was the beginning of something different or just a moment of honesty that would eventually fade, I didn't know. Probably time would answer that. But I'd said what I meant. And I'd heard what he said. And sometimes that has to be enough. It was a Saturday in early May when I drove up to the lake house alone for the first time since everything had settled. The drive was the same as it had always been. The interstate giving way to smaller roads. The smaller roads becoming the two-lane highway lined with pine trees. The two-lane highway eventually narrowing into the gravel road that crunched under my tires the way it always had, announcing arrival. I unlocked the door, the new lock, the changed lock, and walked through the house slowly. The kitchen I'd rebuilt. The floors I'd refinished. The picture window at the front, looking out over the water. I made coffee and took it to the dock. The lake in early May is still and cold and has a quality of absolute privacy. The trees on the far bank were just starting to show the pale green of new leaves. A heron stood in the shallows about 50 yards to my right, absolutely motionless in the way that herons are, like something painted on the air. I sat there for a long time. What I'd learned, I thought, wasn't really about property. It wasn't even really about my brother, specifically, or his particular character, or the particular mistakes he'd made. It was about the confusion that grows when we mistake wanting something for deserving it. When we let desire accumulate into assumption, and assumption harden into expectation, and expectation finally announce itself as entitlement. It happens in small steps, each one deniable, until suddenly you're standing in someone else's kitchen talking about renovations you have no right to plan. Darren hadn't started as a bad person. He'd started as someone who'd never been asked to sit with the difference between what he wanted and what he'd earned. The lake house didn't cause the problem. His unexamined assumption that the people around him would eventually give him what he believed he deserved, that was the problem. The lake house just happened to be specific enough and documented enough and mine enough that the assumption finally ran into something it couldn't reshape. I thought about Brett and the bicycle. I thought about all the small moments where the lesson had been offered and declined. I thought about Qley, who'd loved her son too much to let him be uncomfortable, and in doing so had made certain kinds of discomfort inevitable. I thought about the deed, sitting in a fireproof box in my city apartment, which didn't have opinions about family dynamics or the fairness of childlessness, which just had my name on it, clean and clear. The heron flew. The lake went perfectly flat. I finished my coffee. Owning something isn't what caused the problem. Believing you deserve something you never earned did.